The Champlain condo collapse captured the attention of all Americans. The coverage was immense. After all, there was a possibility, and there still is, that over 100 people may have died. But what is worse is that the warnings were there. Why wasn't there action taken that could have saved lives? What's worse is that this points to a bigger problem, a major U.S. infrastructure crisis. Coming up in today's program, the Florida condo collapse. The signs were there. Cracked columns, crumbling concrete, but management failed to act. Now, does this point to a bigger problem? That's what many are saying the collapse points to, and that is the U.S. infrastructure. Crumbling roads and bridges, schools, water facilities, many at breaking point. How vast is the problem? And finally, U.S. infrastructure. Well, the U.S. President Joe Biden says the U.S. needs to stand up to China and compete with it. Yes, the two are related. He wants to edge out China in education and technology, but what does that have to do with the infrastructure? The building collapsed in Florida. 12 stories, first partially collapsed, then detonated to find the missing bodies. 12-story building collapse should not have happened. The warning signs were there, from a 2018 report that cited major structural damage to visible signs from the building. Officials in Florida scrambled for explanations.
The building has literally pancaked. It has gone down, and I mean there's just feet in between stories where there were 10 feet. That is heartbreaking because it doesn't mean to me that we're going to be successful as we would want to be to find people alive.
But this was just a window into a much wider series of problems. The condo building collapse has now raised concerns that there are other buildings that are in danger of destruction. Take this condo building in nearby North Miami Beach. An engineer's report deemed the building unsafe.
I think this building's about to collapse. There's probably many buildings about to collapse. Look at the wall right there. I mean, if you can see that there,
it had to evacuate around 300 people with a 2-hour notice to clear out over safety concerns, and residents are now worried.
For sure, I wouldn't do it. I do not feel secure in this building. If this building is not in good conditions, you don't want to stay there. And not after of the situation and the tragedy with the Surfside.
The problem is multifaceted. One of them is that buildings that age are not getting inspected in a timely fashion. There are obviously many questions as to what caused the 12-story condo to collapse. Now that some time has passed and investigations have been made, there have been some very important revelations. One of the startling findings based on video footage is that the building fell in stages and not all at once. Now, based on this depiction, this may be the incremental collapse that happened in stages. First, the poolside area may have caved in. Then you have the center of the building, the north in the second phase, and finally, the eastern part. Problems with the condominium were highlighted in a report written by Morabito Consultants back in October 2018, which pointed to a whole host of major problems. Now, this is the report that, with pictures, pointed out to problems that plagued the 12-story condo. The report came with pictures as proof that there were a variety of engineering and construction problems, from balconies to water drainage. Now, even though there were many problems, these were some of the major structural ones that were highlighted, which support the entire building. Weak support columns, cracks in the car park ramps, water damage in concrete slabs that were above the parking level, and cracks in columns and walls. And as if this collapse wasn't bad, it points to a startling reality that Florida, South Florida in particular, could be facing, that it is sinking. Take a look at this picture. Notice the close proximity of the ocean to the condos in this area. That's just one of the problems. Long before the Champlain Towers crashed, the building was actually sinking. Now, an April 2020 study found that the area showed signs of what's called land subsidence, sinking brought on by natural occurrences like hurricanes and worsened by things like groundwater extraction. Okay, joining us for this segment is Ben Carroll from the International Action Center, AIC, short for Information Activism and Resistance to U.S. Militarism, War, and Corporate Greed, links with struggles against racism and oppression within the United States. Ben Carroll, welcome. The Champlain condo collapse, as sad as it may be, had warnings that were not heeded. As I mentioned just now, a 2018 report urged the managers to repair the cracked columns and crumbling concrete. Now, this begs two questions. Why would the owners or management let the structure get to this point of destruction more than 2.5 years after the building managers were actually warned? And why wasn't this fixed before the unfortunate crumbling of the structure, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think like you said, first and foremost, this is a horrific tragedy that claimed the lives of, I think, close to 80 people and displaced hundreds of others. But it's really, one of many examples that we see every day in the United States of the crimes and the injustice of a system that puts profit over human needs. And in this particular case, the negligence goes all the way up the board. It's like you said, the condo board was warned over 3 years ago that there were major structural problems that needed to be addressed immediately to avoid this kind of a catastrophe. The local government, the state government, and even the federal government, that didn't enforce or have in place, adequate safety measures to ensure that, these private owners of a condo complex like this and, tens or hundreds of thousands of similar ones across the country are taking the steps that they need to ensure the safety of the people that live in these buildings. And I think something that's probably the most horrifying about this tragedy is that, how many other buildings like this are there in the United States? Over this last year, there's been a housing boom where, there's been homes, apartment buildings, big condominiums, just like the one in Miami, that have been built very quickly all over the country. Housing prices are at record highs, and so these builders and these private owners of these kinds of complexes are incentivized to get these things built and occupied as quickly as possible, which no doubt means that they're cutting safety corners, they're cutting, trying to cut their own costs, which is potentially putting the lives of tens, if not hundreds of thousands, or maybe even millions more people across this country at risk.
Okay, thank you very much for that. We do appreciate it, Ben Carroll, with your thoughts there. That's Ben Carroll. Stay tuned. I'm going to be right back with our Info News section. Time now for our Info News section, where we take a look at some of the economic news making headlines from around the world. Well, our first stop is in the U.S. The U.S. President Joe Biden has actually signed into law, finally, an executive order aimed at cracking down on big tech firms and promoting competition. Now, basically, he said capitalism without competition, well, that isn't capitalism, it's exploitation. And the problems to have come out of big tech, these are some of them. Personal information gathering, you have buying up of potential competitors, and competing unfairly with small businesses. That's actually a good topic for our next program. Tell us what you think. Moving on to the Vatican, Holy Vatican. You have a major problem there. There was some news that obviously taints its holy image. A judge indicting 10, including a cardinal, for alleged financial crimes. The Vatican judge ordered 10 people, including an Italian cardinal, to stand trial for alleged crimes. Now, it included embezzlement, money laundering, fraud, extortion, and the abuse of office, as if sex abuse scandals were not enough for the Vatican. Moving on to our next topic, West Asia Daesh alert is now in effect. Poverty and inequality is actually paving the way for these Daesh terrorists to resurge in Syria and in Iraq. Now, the U.S. has issued this warning that Daesh is seeking to exploit dire economic conditions to reconstitute its presence in the region. Well, the question is, isn't the rise of Daesh and economic insecurity a result of U.S. war, occupation, and presence in the region, not to mention the U.S. support for the group? Something to think about. Finally, a hunger reality check in effect here. When it comes to COVID-19 and death, Oxfam has stated that a year and a half since COVID-19, deaths from hunger are actually outpacing the virus. Some of the reasons: ongoing conflict, economic disruptions of the pandemic, and an escalating climate crisis have pushed millions more people into extreme levels of food insecurity. Well, it's time for a quick break here on Economic Divide, but don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Time now for our in-depth section where we take a deeper look into the topic of this program. Now, this segment we have called the Failure to Act segment in reference to what if the U.S. does not play catch-up and spend the money or enough money on its infrastructure. Well, the American Society of Civil Engineers actually issues a report with the same name, Failure to Act. And this is what the infographic looks like. We're going to take a look at what happens over the next 20 years. Now, over this time span, the overdue infrastructure bill will cost the average American household $3,300 per year. Now, it states that things like poor roads and airports actually means travel times increase. Now, an aging electric grid and inadequate water distribution makes utilities unreliable. So, problems like these translate into higher costs for businesses to manufacture and to distribute goods and to provide services. Now, these higher costs, in turn, unfortunately then have to get passed on to guess who? Workers and families, basically Main Street. Now, if the U.S. does not act by the year 2039 on its poor infrastructure, it is forecast to lose a lot of money, $10.3 trillion in GDP from 2020 through 2039. Now, we already have passed 2020. That's nearly half of the annual U.S. GDP in 2019. Also, $2.4 trillion in exports from 2020 through 2039, or more than half of all the profits of Fortune 500 companies that was generated in 2019. And finally, 3 million jobs. That's 2 times the number of Walmart employees in the U.S. Now, what is worrying is that it's not as if the U.S. has not spent money on its infrastructure throughout the years. Taking a look at this graph, which starts from the year 2007 and goes to the year 2017, you can see that $450 billion for the year 2007 was spent on U.S. infrastructure. It peaked roughly at around $465 billion, with a low in the year 2013 of a little bit below $430 billion. Now, let's see what our guest thinks about this. Joining us for this segment is Norman Stockwell. He is a radio host and political commentator. He's also the publisher of the Progressive magazine, which has the slogan, "A Voice for Peace and Social Justice," since the year 1909. Okay, Norman, welcome. Taking a look at the report 2021, it's a report card for America's infrastructure. It found U.S.'s infrastructure earned a cumulative grade of C-. Now, reports prior to that actually got grades of D+ on several occasions, with roads, bridges, water infrastructure, and schools to be near destruction, based on what the report said, and dilapidated after years of negligence. So the national question is, why is the U.S. infrastructure left alone to its demise when the U.S. is spending excessively in other areas like wars, nuclear bombs, military spending, and military assistance to places like Israel?
It's been a very serious problem here in the United States for many years that money has not been invested in infrastructure, and we've seen deterioration in the road system, in the bridges. The last time there were large federal expenditures to build up roads and bridges in the United States, I think, was in the 1960s. And since that time, what we've seen is, particularly with Republicans in power, a moving away from supporting infrastructure and also moving towards the privatization of both services and infrastructure systems. And so instead of having government oversight and government funds going into upkeeping the national infrastructure, what you've seen is things being privatized and therefore money not spent by corporations that really look to the bottom line, that look to save a dollar in every place they can. Now, on top of that, the sentiment of the voters has been towards privatization and towards not spending money on projects like infrastructure because they see it as wasteful. So it's been very difficult here in the United States, and I think this is the hurdle that the new Biden administration is facing as they try to implement infrastructure improvement programs.
Very well. Thank you very much for that, Norman. We're going to bring Norman actually back a little bit later into the program. Okay. In our first report, we covered the Florida building collapse and how it points to 2 major problems. One was how U.S.'s aging high-rises may also be in danger, requiring major renovation and inspection. Well, the next problem, which is a crisis in many respects, is what we just talked about. That points to America's infrastructure problem.
Some of that work involves building our country's infrastructure. America's roads, bridges, dams, highways, and ports, they're critical to our nation's success.
Trillions of dollars in taxpayers' money. U.S.'s failing infrastructure, a major concern for decades. Each president has come and gone, promising to spend billions and even trillions of dollars on it.
Every president over the past 4 or 5 presidents has talked about doing a big infrastructure package. You may recall that President Trump proposed a $2 trillion infrastructure package.
The current U.S. president originally proposed $1.9 trillion, but got half of that.
We had a really good meeting, and to answer your direct question, we have a deal. And I think it's really important. We've all agreed that none of us got what we wanted. I clearly didn't get all I wanted. They gave more than I think maybe they were inclined to give in the first place.
The American Society of Civil Engineers grades U.S.'s infrastructure every 4 years, and the U.S. has barely made it above the D range.
Now, the American Society of Civil Engineers gives America's infrastructure a poor grade. 1 out of every 5 miles of highway pavement is in bad condition.
We have 16 categories of infrastructure. We put together a pool of experts, about 30 different civil engineers who are analyzing. A lot of it is data that's available through the federal government. So we're looking at aviation, bridges, roads, transit, dams, levees, schools, parks, solid waste, drinking water, wastewater. So all of these different categories are analyzed. Unfortunately, 12 out of the 16 categories are in the D range, which is poor or at risk, which is really reflecting a lot of our infrastructure being at the end of its useful life.
The problem is time. Roadways and bridges are still in use decades after the end of their lifespans. Sewer and water systems are decaying, and a changing climate has added to the wear and tear.
You've heard and reported that in Miami-Dade County, there's what's called a 40-year recertification for 40-year-old buildings. That only exists in 2 counties in Florida, Miami-Dade and Broward, which is essentially Fort Lauderdale and its surroundings. Why not a statewide standard? Why 40 years? Perhaps it should be 30 or 20 years or periodically.
We led the world in the middle of the 20th century. We led the world.
The U.S. president, however, is pushing for 2 infrastructure bills. Beside one on buildings, he also wants to invest in human infrastructure, like in preschool and higher education. His reason? To ensure U.S. global leadership in the face of a rising power from China.
In fact, it's the largest American jobs investment since World War II. It will create millions of jobs, good paying jobs. It will grow the economy, make us more competitive around the world, promote our national security interests, and put us in a position to win the global competition with China.
He recently said that China is going full bore and has left the U.S. far behind in dollars spent on research and development. He also said a giant infrastructure revamp would send a signal to ourselves and to the world that American democracy can work and deliver for the people.
In 2008, the proposition came out and California voted to have high-speed rail started. We're seeing the product of that. A lot of men and women are coming out here and working on that, and we're finally pushing something out.
It was just a big mess, and it still is. It's unorganized. If we have to call somebody, they're not going to be there right now. They either quit or got fired, or it's just a big unorganized mess, and they know it.
Okay, time now to get both guests in this section to see what their thoughts are on the next question and compare it with each other. Greg Carroll from the International Action Center rejoins us along with Norman Stockwell, who's a radio host and political commentator. All right, first let me start with you, Norman Stockwell. The U.S. President Joe Biden has gotten an agreement with the Republicans for $1.2 trillion out of the $2 trillion that he had requested for the infrastructure spending, building on top of what his predecessor, the former U.S. President Donald Trump, started. But even that amount appears not to be enough. One report said, in addition to grading 17 categories of infrastructure, the report found $2.59 trillion investment gap over 10 years between what the U.S. currently projected to spend and what it must spend to bring systems back to a state of good repair. So where does that leave Biden? Sounds like some hard choices actually need to be made. After all, people's lives and health are at risk here.
Well, I think the Biden administration initially pushed for a very broad infrastructure bill and a significant amount of spending. And the Republicans in Congress have fought back against that, not only in terms of the amount of spending, but in terms of the places that that money would be spent. I think it's very important to note that in the original Biden proposal, the discussion was of having internet access for everyone being a part of basic infrastructure, having child care support and health care and so on, all of these things that really are part of the infrastructure of a society, even if they're not physical things like bridges or roads. The Republicans have argued for a much more narrow definition of infrastructure to be those specific bricks and mortar items, if you will, like the repair of roads or bridges.
Carol, we'd like to ask you about this 2021 report card that came out from the Engineers for America's Infrastructure, which gave the U.S. a grade of C-. Now, prior to that, a grade of D+, was issued on several occasions. And you had the same old problems that covered things like roads, bridges, water infrastructure, for example, or even schools that are near destruction. Why do you think the U.S. infrastructure is left to the state that it is? Money not being spent on it, administration after administration, when, again, you have things that the money is going to, like military spending, like nuclear weapons, in the trillions of dollars practically.
Yeah, the U.S. is the richest country in the history of the world. And there's no reason why, with infrastructure, things like roads, bridges, buildings, schools, all of this, there's no reason that they should be in the state of disrepair that they are, and that there's tragedies like what happened in Miami and similar, scenes that we're seeing even just this past few weeks all across the country where, in New York City, for example, the subway system there was totally flooded, when there was a flash flood storm that came through. There's wildfires out west, and there's, incredibly historic heat affecting, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people across this country. And it really comes down to the U.S. is much more interested in profit and protecting its interests abroad by pouring hundreds of billions or over $1 trillion into the military, by giving tax breaks to the rich. And there's many municipalities across the country who will give also these massive handouts to these corporations, on the promise of bringing jobs and things like this, so that they'll build and relocate, their company headquarters or this or that operation to their city. Meanwhile, the wear and tear that takes on the infrastructure in those places is passed off to working class people. And so, ultimately the U.S. is much more interested in protecting the rich and their interests abroad than they are about, doing the very meager things that would ensure, a good, secure, and safe life for, the majority of working class people in this country.
The story of the U.S. infrastructure to be in such a sad state, well, it's a sad story. It's basically misappropriating funds, that's right, to areas where American lives are not as important as, let's say, in the area of military spending or wars. I mean, it's quite ironic that the U.S. actually says that the military spending is for national security's sake, to protect American lives. Yet at home, people are losing their lives due to poor infrastructure, from roads to tainted water to bridges to you name it. That does for this edition of Economic Divide. Your questions and comments are always welcome. From me, Kobe Tafway, and the entire team, it's goodbye until next time.